Behind this locked gate lie the treasures of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Thousands of rare ancient books and manuscripts in the library and university collections. Ethiopian prayer books. Heavily illuminated books of hours from the Middle Ages. Documents signed by kings and queens. Captain's journals from 18th century Mediterranean voyages. Qurans in graceful Arabic script. Multilingual books on almost every subject from the 15th century forward. These carefully curated shelves contain volume after volume, holding the wisdom and knowledge of the past for the understanding of the future. But whose future? Will these books, painstakingly preserved for centuries, even have a future? Will the next generation care that they exist? Do you even understand why they should exist? If these volumes are going to have value in the coming decades, if Himmel's work over the last half-century is going to matter in the next century, then the future generation of scholars must be fostered. And what better place to nurture this than in the middle of a university campus brimming with 21st century young adults? Can these pages speak to them? How can these inquisitive, visually bombarded, developing minds relate to the quiet, age-old documents written in languages they can't read or even understand? Do they even care? Do you even care? Join two of my young colleagues and me as we work to explore what these pages have to say to us today and answer the ultimate question: why care?
Mark, Claire, the last time we were in the Rare Book collection, Dr. Mugler and I chose the book that we had to talk about. I thought it might be more interesting if the two of you were given the opportunity to explore the shelves on your own and see if you can find something that piques your interest. How's that sound?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good.
Let's do it, right?
There you are.
Heck yeah.
Enjoy the shelves.
Look at this one.
Oh, yeah?
How pretty that cover is.
Wow.
Oh, and the inside too. Some Latin.
Yeah.
I don't know. This book's, I think this might be the book. I don't know why. What do you think?
No, I agree.
Wanna
Let's
try
go.
it?
Let's go do it.
Yeah, let's see what we can find.
So, Mark, we were just down in the Rare Book collection. Tim, thankfully, let us go down there.
Yes.
And this book caught your eye.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that some more.
Yeah. I don't know. There's plenty of beautiful books down there. I don't know that this one's any more special than the rest of them, but I mean, first off, compared to any books we have now, cover, it's pretty dang nice.
It's pretty nice.
That's very pretty.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a lot of care, craftsmanship.
I mean, it looks really quite old, but also it's aged quite well. You can see there's some points where it's coming apart, but it's very, very beautiful. You can tell someone cared about this a lot.
Well, yeah, and it's in pretty good condition.
Yes.
So,
but
I mean,
you know what we shouldn't do? We shouldn't judge a book by its cover.
No, you're right. You're right.
I
God,
know. When
we
I'm
fell
right,
into the
when
trap.
I'm right, I'm right.
So let's open it up.
Nothing.
Very
first
interesting
page.
stuff
Yeah,
so
yeah,
far.
so far.
You know what? That's a very
Ooh.
beautiful page. Some fine
Wow.
detail as well, but clearly
I've got
This
a
has
little
been
Latin
patched
under my
up.
belt, but I can see that this is a book.
I have a little bit more Latin than you.
that's
I'm
funny.
up a semester and a half, but I'm down a year. So
Oh, yeah,
you
there
know.
you go. There you go.
But yeah, year. That's
you can
what I'm
see,
seeing.
and I noticed this earlier, is you can see like you have this beautiful sort of illumination, if you want, or just sort of decoration here. Not
Yep.
really illumination, but
Well, it's got gold.
it's got gold. But then you can see they stop it here, and there's like a repaired page it looks like the bottom of, oh no. I was
Runs.
gonna say it runs through, but then it changes as it goes,
Yeah.
as both the,
Well, and it's kind of patchy in places.
it is, like here, now we have the original sort of bottom part here, it looks like, but this, did they have to go through and repair?
Oh, well, it looks
Page by
like
page?
it. I mean, I wonder what happened to this book. You know, if its pages could
No.
tell a story.
We said it
other
was
than
cared for,
figurative.
but maybe it wasn't cared for and it had to be cared for again.
Yeah, yeah, that's, I guess. But you know, you never know. I'm bad at taking care of my books, ironically, because this is my job. But
But that's a very good point. I do think it's interesting to think about not only that someone did this once, but it was important enough at some point later down the line to do it again. That to me is really, really cool. And we take this all for granted nowadays, for sure. I mean, I'm sure I could find this online somewhere and not have to worry about handling this super old book. But, you know, it got here, it got to the online world, to the digital space through all of these copies over and over again through time. People caring to write in letters that we can still read, even though I can't really read this because it's Latin. I can read the letters. I know my alphabet well enough. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Pretty proud of that.
good. So
That's kind of all I got on the first
we
page.
know. Okay, so that's Juvenal is. So we were working with Juvenal,
Oh, the Roman poet.
the Roman poet.
Oh,
If we
isn't that the
I almost said if we scroll. Gosh,
scroll?
if we scroll through this.
Well, this probably was
manuscript-
written on a scroll first, right?
Well, it might have been.
So there's something there.
Here we go.
Another one.
Perseus.
Persei. Persei
Can you
Hockey
guess who's that? Who that might be?
Persei. Trying to think of the declension right
Perseus?
now.
Perseus.
Perseus, like the from the myth, guy who kills Medusa.
Could be. Could be. Could be. So we've got two different books that we're working with here.
Yeah. So this is a combination book here then.
Yeah, two bound together.
Well, and I'll say all I know really about Juvenal is he's the bread and circuses guy, right? He's the guy who says this famous line about the fall of the Roman Empire, but that's kind of all I got. So clearly he had a lot more to say than whoever you say bread and circus is in Latin.
Panem.
Panem?
Kirkim. I think
Kirkim?
that's probably what it is.
Panem
Something
et
like that.
Kirkim?
I-
Yeah, if it's
that's
the
my
accusative,
guess.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I haven't even gotten there in my Roman Empire class, so
Oh.
I'm probably a few days short
You
of
let me
knowing
know,
more about Juvenal.
You let me know when your professor has you reading this book one day, right?
Yeah.
You can bring it up from him. We'll be like, hold on, I know a guy.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, we don't know it, but,
No.
you know, that hasn't stopped us before from caring about a manuscript, so.
That's true. I think there is something we could definitely glean out of this once we learn more about it. And I'm really looking forward to doing so.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Heintzelman. Really appreciate you taking time away from work to be here with us today. We were wondering, you look certainly like a distinguished scholar of the Western collections here at the Himmel Manuscripts, but I'm sure you didn't, come out looking like that when you started here at Himmel. How did you get to Himmel and know you wanted to start this position here?
Well, I figured I needed to come here so I could stay long enough for my hair to turn white. I actually came here through a long and winding road approach, sort of to quote the Beatles.
Oh, yeah.
I was a language major in college. I studied German language and literature because I was trying to be very practical, and do something that would get me a job straight away. And went right into graduate school after that. Spent many years in graduate school. Taught English in Vienna for a couple of years back in the early 1980s.
Wow.
And after that, came back and worked in a translation bureau where I met my future wife, and we're still together after all this time. Fortunately, we worked in different departments she was in the Spanish department, I was in the German department.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect.
And during that time, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and worked in the library for about 8 years. And I went through numerous jobs, but the last job I had there was in charge of the rare books office at the University of Chicago. Now, it was not a professional position, it was a managerial position, the way they pictured it. I was able to use that experience along with the language experience, working with German, working with Latin, and then went to library school. And shortly after starting library school, someone came to me with a job posting. I wasn't looking for a job at the time, I was just starting library school. I had finished the PhD in the meantime, of course, but the job description asked for someone who had experience with rare books and manuscripts, which I had from the University of Chicago. They wanted someone who was fluent in German. They wanted someone who had experience in medieval studies and who wanted to work in a library. And this person came to me and said, I can't think of anyone this describes except you. And I said, okay, well, I guess I have to look at it. and so here I am, 22 years later.
Wow.
So, yeah, so I did not come out of high school or college thinking that, I would be working with medieval manuscripts or anything old like that. I came from an environment where something that was 100 years old was really old. And now I have things on my desk that might be 500 years old. And I did not plan on becoming a curator or even moving to Minnesota. None of those things had been part of the plan when I started out.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd say the same probably for both of us. I didn't think I'd be looking at these medieval manuscripts here either, but how funny is that, the way life takes us here?
Well, you take the advantages and the opportunities when they're presented, and then if you can do something with that later, that's the important thing. You learn from all directions at all times, and it's how you use those things you learn to move on to new experiences.
So, I mean, to get to why we're all here today, we have this beautiful manuscript. You were saying that you get to work with things that are 500 years old. Is that accurate for this?
That would be accurate for this book. This book was probably copied in the 15th or 16th century.
Wow.
If in the 16th, it would be very early, so I think it's probably 15th century.
Wow.
So if you think about that, you're going back to a time, very likely a time where people had never heard of North America or South America. It certainly wouldn't have had those names for it. And they were rediscovering an earlier time. So this is a fascinating period to look at.
Wow.
It's hard to imagine. I was going to say, it's hard to remember that time. I was not there for that time. It is hard to imagine that time and that time frame. What does that say about the context in this book? As I recall, this is a Juvenal Satires from ancient Rome. Is this what you're referencing with rediscovering old things and
in a
looking at them again?
In a way, yes. There are a couple things that were going on. There was a lot of renewed interest in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And this is actually a book that has two different authors in it. It's got Juvenal and the Satires of Juvenal, and then almost always when they produce that, they include the Satires of Perseus. And so what it's actually open to at the moment, I should say, is the beginning of the Perseus text. And that's why you have that large letter up there. That's the beginning of his text. And the page that comes before it, and just open it gently, you see that there's this little phrase down here, which is partly in Greek and partly in Latin, and it's finished to God. And very often you have thanks be to God, it's finished. Now the Greek word I don't read, but I'm guessing it might be the Greek word for God as well. But
I see.
Yeah, you're the Greek scholar.
I'm the Greek scholar. Well, what I can say is that is not a very proper sigma. There are two different ways to write sigmas. And that is what you would use at the beginning or end of a word, or beginning or middle of a word. At the end, it's more of a shape instead of like that. But yes, that would be accurate otherwise.
So
I think it just means end.
End. So that also means end?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
But Deo is certainly God.
Yes, to God. And as I say, it's
good old dative.
It's meant to be a way of saying sort of thanks be to God for the end of the work.
Yeah.
As in, like, I'm done with this. Thank God. That kind of thing?
Indeed. And sometimes that's what they're doing. And they sometimes ask, in a more religious text, this is a secular text, but in a more religious text, you might have something where someone might say, please pray to God for me, or something like that. So there may be other little phrases that are mixed into the colophon.
Gotcha. Is this then, I haven't ever written a whole book myself. Is it pretty hard work writing in this context with material?
It probably wasn't as much work as we might think.
Oh, really?
today. But there were examples of things being copied by hand. Even today, books are still copied by hand in some places. Many of the books that we photographed in places like Ethiopia, the Hill Library photographed books that were copied in the 20th century. And even now we do photography in some parts of the world where books are still being copied by hand. And you would be learning it in the process. By copying it, you would also be internalizing some of what you were writing. And in a sense, we might guess that someone who did something like this in the 15th century would be doing the same thing. They would be learning as they're copying. Even as a professional, they would be picking up things as they go. It would become part of their life.
So it's deeply personal for everyone involved, but especially for the people who are creating these books.
Oh yeah.
And to think that was, only 50 years ago or so, and this book's 500 years old, and it's still in our collection, and still very much representing what St. John's was founded on and what it still is today.
Oh yes. The interest in Latin, the interest in classics, that's an important part of our heritage at St. John's and at St. Ben's.
Absolutely. One that's been cut a little bit, but we're not going to get too far into that.
I'm afraid I'm not able to say anything on that subject.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing thinking about, of course, age in regard to this textbook and how it is very much a product of its time. But I love, and one of the main things I noticed with this book was all of these corrections that were made. The book itself has seen better days.
Yeah.
And especially on this page here, you can see a lot of places where there was repair work done. It looks like these are maybe even different fabrics. The handwriting looks similar but different. What can you say about this?
Well, at some point when the manuscript was originally produced in the 15th century, that would have been a full page of material. And at some point, something happened, either that it was torn or likely it got wet. You could see what looks like water damage in here. And you have to remember that the ink on the page is sitting on the surface. So like if this were a printed book, the ink is actually attached to the page and you can't wash it off. But if it's a manuscript, the ink floats on the surface, so to speak, and if it gets wet, it washes away. It also weakens the material. So this is on parchment. And even the part that's added is also parchment. So it's all animal skin. So they're made from the same kind of material, but as you noted, this seems to be a lesser quality of material down here because they were just trying to patch the corners where it had been damaged. Also, when you look at it, you might notice how it changes color. You see all the little spots in here on this side of the page. If you turn over the page, you see it looks very smooth and white. And that's because those are the two sides of the animal skin.
Oh, yeah.
You've probably heard about that,
the hairy
right?
side and the smooth side.
Right, so this side would be the hair side, and this side, so you see all those little spots. And this side where it's very smooth, that would be the flesh side.
Oh, interesting.
There we go.
Wow, something we don't think about so much in our books anymore.
No, and
we don't have to worry about it.
And you guys have worked a bit with the St. John's Bible. You know that with the St. John's Bible, they're able to produce vellum. If they process it far enough, it's very difficult to tell one side from the other.
Yeah.
But in manuscripts of this period, it's very common that you can see which side was the flesh side and which side was the hair side. And that can also tip you off if somebody's been playing around with the pages, because generally hair side and flesh sides should match each other. They should. If you get one side that's hair and one side that's flesh, then you got a problem. Somebody moved some of the pages or took a page out or something like that.
So would these corrections then say on this page, are these both flesh side then? Are they trying to match with the corrections as well? Yeah,
I think they're trying to match it so that they come out the same way, so that they still match.
Well, because then if you have hairy side and then flesh side together, they might kind of buckle a little bit differently over time as well. Correct?
That's yeah. It would look funny. It would look odd to the person's eyes. Now, as you noted, there are other patches in here. It looks like somebody just kind of glued something on to hold it together. But also, the handwriting is so substantially different because it was done by a different person.
Yeah.
It could have been done many years later. It could have been done hundreds of years later.
Wow.
It's very difficult to tell because of the way it's copied. whether that would have been it's not necessarily a particular handwriting that you could associate with the 18th or 19th or 20th century.
Yeah.
But it's possible that it was done much, much later.
Wow.
And they were also not quite as expert. So the people who originally made this book, you see these little lines, very faint lines on the page here.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, and that's what we refer to as the ruling.
Okay.
Ruling.
So when,
Yeah.
yes, ruling, and that's where you get the word ruler, okay? Well, that's because what you've got is a piece of skin that doesn't have anything on it. How are you going to write on that to keep the line straight? If you're going to keep the line straight, you have to draw lines on there, and that's what they did here. Was they used, sometimes they used an ink pen or a quill or something to make lines across, or sometimes they use a dry point and they just sort of etch a very faint line in there. But that's what happens here and here, and then there would be lines drawn across. Well, the replacement pages, you'll notice on some of them, are actually kind of crooked looking. First page is most noticeable. If you look at that, you can see just how awkward that is.
Yeah.
Here it's very uniform,
yeah.
and down here it's like, well, they didn't quite think about keeping the line straight. Okay?
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right.
So I would say this was probably done by an amateur, somebody who wanted to preserve the book and cared for it,
Yeah.
but not somebody who was trained in how to do that. And the person who did this work up here would have been a professional. This would have been their job. And whether it was one person or more than one person, it's hard for me to say at this point. But up here, I think you see that it's also been repaired. Somebody has filled in some letters up here. So this little section here looks like it's original, but then all these uppercase letters or capitals at the top look very different, and so that was probably added later as well. This style of decoration, the letter S that you see in gold there, that is very classic for the humanist manuscripts from Italy in the 15th century. So that kind of decoration definitely places it into that same period. And sometimes you'll even see that in early printed books, which is kind of cool. There's this transition mentality that when they first started printing books, which is in this same period, that the printed books should look like manuscripts.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so what's cool about that is that then they'll leave a gap there for someone to add that initial by hand to try to use decoration that makes it look more like a manuscript. Now, think about this in terms of what we do today. We've been used to what books look like today for 500 years. This is the way a book would have looked like up to the 15th century. You guys, I think, have noted before, there's no title page, right?
Yeah.
We take title pages for granted. There's got to be one. There's no index. There are no page numbers. The only numbers that are on the leaves were added by someone in the 20th century. That's 20th century handwriting up there in the corner.
Yeah.
In fact, it might have even been added by somebody here when we received it as a gift. This came to us as a gift. Now, so you have this transition of print books trying to look like manuscripts, and then by the end of the 15th century into the 16th century, the print books start to add title pages, indexes. At first they put folio numbers like this on one side, not on both, and later they put page numbers on both. Okay, so it's on front and back. And that's the book that we received. Now, when you see an e-book today, oftentimes the e-book might look like, we often come in a format, an Adobe Reader, a PDF. And what do you see when you look at it? When you look at that picture on your screen, what does it look like to you?
Like a print book?
Like a print book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are in a totally, we are in the same thing right now that they were going through 500 years ago. They assumed initially that a print book has to look like a manuscript. Today we're going from print to electronic, and we assume that an electronic book has to look like a print book.
Wow.
So in the 50 years after about the time this manuscript was made, they changed the rules as to what a book looks like. in the next 50 years, the time that you guys will be, going into your careers and doing things, what we think of as an ebook may be completely different.
Yeah.
True.
You may be experiencing the book in a totally different way, not just from looking at it on a screen, but use your imagination. What could be different about the way books are today? Because we're still carrying on that print book mentality online to what it will be like in 2050,
Yeah, you're right.
2060.
Never thought about that.
No, I've never thought about that either.
Could have gone my whole life probably without even thinking about things in that sort of mindset. But yeah. Wow.
And that print book mindset you talk about, I think, is so interesting because there's so much in this manuscript that, I mean, you just wouldn't see in a print book. The gold lettering here, the wonderful decoration, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think someone would work to repair this in the first place, even if it is maybe a little bit slipshod? I have to wonder that. We don't think about books that way anymore, or even ebooks.
Well, again, it was something that was meant to last. It was meant to be permanent. And so if it was a book that you really weren't going to use anymore, were you just going to throw it away? Or were you going to try to give it a little more life? And with many books, especially books that weren't being used anymore, they might reuse them. They might wash off the ink and write a new text on it, because parchment was very expensive and still is. But also they might cut them up and use them to patch other books. We have manuscripts like that in the collection. So if you have this amount of damage, you kind of have to choose which way you're going to go. Are you going to recycle the materials and use it somewhere else? Or are you going to fix it and try to make it usable for someone in the future? Now in this case, the damage is not all the way through the book. There's several pages like that, several leaves that are damaged, but most of it is actually still intact. So that's an argument for trying to preserve it, because you have something there that you can still use, right? Juvenal has never really gone out of style. He's always been somebody that's been studied all the way back into the early Middle Ages. There aren't a lot of manuscripts, but there are enough to carry through. And then, as I said, in this period in the 15th century, there's a resurgence of interest in him and other Roman authors. It's also this period that some of the earliest editions of Juvenal are being prepared in print. And so this is from that same period where there just is enough demand that people want it. And it never goes out of style. Now, in this particular case, also, the book has probably been rebound at some point. The binding, to me, looks like it could be later. It could be 18th century, although it's hard to tell from the style, the very elaborate, ornate style on the cover. But also this paper, which is laid paper, that is to say it should be somewhat acid-free, although it has faded. But you can see lines. If you see the light through it, you can see the lines.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how the paper was made by hand. Okay.
Whoa.
Oh, yeah.
And there's even a watermark down there in the corner. You could just barely see the watermark down here that would have told you who made the paper at one time.
Oh, cool.
But that would have been done later, because they probably in the 15th century, they wouldn't have used that kind of material for a parchment manuscript. That was probably something that was rebound. And so somebody was trying, and they may have done the repairs on the pages at the same time they rebounded. So, so they gave the book added life by doing those little things. But the scribe doesn't give any kind of information as to when or where it was copied.
Dang.
It was
Wouldn't it be nice if they did, huh?
Yeah, we assume it was probably copied in Italy in large part because of the script.
Okay.
Manuscripts of even Latin manuscripts that would be copied in Northern Europe at this time would have been copied in more of a Gothic script.
Okay.
And there are numerous Gothic scripts, but this one is very definitely a humanist script, which was an attempt to get away from Gothic, but also, again, an attempt to try to resurrect handwriting styles that were used centuries before by the ancient Romans.
Oh.
And so that is another reflection of that time when they are starting to take an interest in ancient Rome.
How then do we make sense of this manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, what's the point of keeping it? I mean, I've had Latin for a whole, 6 weeks now? I think I'd be pretty good, but I cannot make heads or tails of this manuscript one way or another, is it? And I'm sure there are a lot of kids who can't read a lick of this. Why do we still hold on to it?
Well, we hold on to it because it's a piece of history that we wouldn't have imagined otherwise. If you can picture yourself, think about the person who wrote this, but also the person who first read it. They lived 500 years ago.
Yeah.
That book, what you're looking at, was in front of that person 500 years ago. Okay?
Yeah.
And think about all the people who came in between who have picked that book up and looked at it and read it. Or maybe just looked at it and admired it. Okay? There's a continuity between you and someone who lived 500 years ago. You are part of that same process that they went through of discovery. And maybe you'll come back and maybe you'll say, I think I'd like to study Juvenal and I'd like to know more about his writings. Why was he popular with Christians in the Middle Ages? This secular, non-Christian author, he lived before Christianity was in power, so why would they take an interest in him back then? Why should we be interested now? But also, a book like this tells us a lot about how things were opening up. So the early printed editions, this is a very nice, clean copy. It's got very little. There are some corrections in there. There are abbreviations, things like that. The correction shows that somebody cared enough to go through and correct the text, make sure it's clean. But also, there are printed versions of these texts that came out about the same time that have very extensive commentaries, where you might only have like 5 to 10 lines of the text and a few pages of commentary to go with that text.
Oh my gosh.
So you can imagine if your professor tells you, okay, well, go home and read the first satire of Juvenal. And in here, the first satire might be only 5 to 10 pages long, but your study edition is going to be 100 pages long. Okay, that's at the same time this is being produced. So this is one of the reasons why we want to see these things is it's the connection to the past, but it's also the diversity of what existed in the past that we want to know about. And the fact that there isn't just one thing. So when you pick up your, if you have to read this for class and you buy your Penguin edition, you realize that the Penguin edition isn't the end result of everything. It is just one more way of presenting this author and these ideas to people.
So this isn't somewhere on a perfectly straight timeline of Juvenal, you would say?
No, this was a time when Juvenal was actually so popular. There were probably many copies of this out there. It was probably sort of a mini industry that the people were copying this to have their own copy, but then also they started printing it, as I say, fairly early. Our oldest copy in the St. John's collection is from 1498. And it's substantially thicker than this because of all the commentary that's in it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, so that's almost the same time as this was being prepared. And ultimately for me, it always comes back to that we are part of a community of scholars. That it's not just the people we talk to today, but we are also in dialogue with people from the past. And perhaps in some ways what we leave behind will be in dialogue with people in the future. Maybe they'll do a biological test on some of the material there, and they'll be able to tell us, well, what kind of animal was this made from? Or who held it at what time?
Oh, my fingerprints are on it now. Oh my gosh.
Your DNA is part of this book.
Whoa.
Wow.
Ooh, I'm
I
in that
guess
thing
I should
forever
go
now.
too, huh?
Yeah.
So we've spent some time talking about sort of the more personal, how this got here and why it matters to preserve it. What is some wisdom that you would have to share with us from decades of working with these manuscripts here at HMML and in general?
I think the biggest thing for me is just to never take anything for granted. When I look at it, this is one item in our collection. We have many manuscripts. We have over 10,000, perhaps 11,000 rare printed books, of which probably about 40% of them or more are over 200 years old. That is, they were printed before 1800. And so a lot of those books can tell us little things as we go. Sometimes they're the most mundane things in the world. And the book, you look at it and you say, well, this is really a book that's of no interest to me. But then there's something that will come across that you'll go, well, that's different. I hadn't realized that, someone would. Just yesterday I picked up a book in our stacks, and it happened to be a book by someone who's considered sort of the father of modern paleography and diplomatics, which is the study of documents, okay, to authenticate documents. His name was Jean Mabillon. He was a French Benedictine. And he wrote this little book on the bread in the Eucharist or something like that, totally unrelated to paleography. But on the cover of the book, I noticed when I picked it up, someone had written out a chart that basically was a multiplication table, much like what I used to use when I was in grade school. And I looked at that and I was like, oh my God, this is probably a couple hundred years old. That suddenly hit me. It's like, this is somebody doing something a couple hundred years ago that I was doing in grade school.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the kind of thing that I find some sort of attachment to. I get intrigued by these little stories, not by oh, this is a famous work, you need to know this work, but the little things that appear. One of our Spanish manuscripts has a table where someone was writing down all the dates of what are called the movable feasts. You're familiar with that term? A movable feast in Catholic and Western liturgical tradition is things like Easter and Pentecost and Corpus Christi, those ones that change their date every year, okay? And somebody started charting this out probably in the 18th century, and this manuscript that we have, they apparently charted it all the way down to the year 2000.
Whoa.
So I'm looking at this chart and I'm going, okay, page after page, and the last entry is for the year 2000. And I'm going, my God, were they waiting for me to come along and continue the chart or something? I mean, it's just, it's those little things that to me are really the story of who we are as people. It's not the story of the big famous people who are out there leading the battles and running the country. It's the story of all of us who are involved in these little things. Maybe it's learning Latin by reading Juvenal. Maybe it's saying your daily prayers by opening up your book of hours to a certain place. Maybe it's drawing a beard on somebody on a picture, which I've seen in our books as well. It's part of that play of life that comes through in the things that we see around us. Wow. That's where it hits me the deepest.
Yeah.
And I mean, that became obvious to me when I cut my finger on a 500-year-old page. So if you can get a paper cut from a 500-year-old book, you're really into the center of what's going on.
Then your DNA is really
there
on the page.
You try to make sure you don't bleed on the page.
So you fit into these as a scholar of these books, and as someone who's been here for the past 22 years, but aside from my thumbprint now being on that page, where do you think someone like me or students nowadays might fit into what these books have to offer and what they represent for moving forward?
I think to them it represents possibilities. I think it's a way of seeing the world differently from what they're used to seeing. This book, we've digitized this book. You can look at this book online. You could go into reading room, the V. Himmel reading room, and go through page by page and read it. That's fine. But to have the actual physical thing in front of you, it's just a different experience. Mm-hmm. And to have the opportunities that these present for you to interact with the real thing, with reality. That it's not faked. It's not, somebody didn't go in and make it, use artificial intelligence to make it look like something it's not. That to me is where students could really benefit from working with something like this, whether it's to read it, whether it's to learn about it, whether it's to think about, a little differently about what they take for granted. We mentioned earlier about how we're in a transition as to what we think a book is. To go back and look at that and consider ourselves as being not the end result, but part of a process. I think that's what these things help us to understand. And it's about what you take out of this, what you feel is important. And it may not be what I find. You may come away with something totally different. You may experience it differently. And in the Middle Ages, they did too. So some people would finish writing the book and they'd say, thanks be to God. And some people would say, boy, that was a waste of time. Or some people might say, this is that they don't agree with something. But it's how you respond to the things around you. And to bear in mind that what we see electronically is really a reflection of reality. The reality isn't a reflection of what's on our computer screen.
A good reminder for all of us moving forward, huh? Yeah, and you've given us such a responsibility now to continue to be stewards of these works and to continue wondering about them. But you're right.
When I graduated from college, which was 44 years ago now, I never dreamt I'd be working with materials like this. It just wasn't it wasn't part of my psyche.
Well, as someone who hasn't graduated college yet, I also never dreamt that I'd be staring in front of a 500-year-old text right here as beautiful as this one.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to sit down and chat with you guys on this.
Yeah.
No, Dr. Heintzelman, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for opening our eyes to what these books mean for us now and what they might mean in the future as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Man, I just loved talking with Dr. Heintzelman. He is like so smart. I just feel like it's rubbing off on me, all of his wisdom.
All his wisdom, yeah. Not just smart, but wise. I mean,
my gosh.
honestly, he says stuff that it's just, I couldn't even process it. I've been thinking about it for weeks on end, but we had to write it down. We had to go back and write it down.
I know. I'm glad we wrote some notes because there's just so many like nuggets he just slipped in there that are such gold. What he said, what was it about that we make digital books that look like printed books, and they originally made printed books that looked like this manuscript here. I thought that was so interesting, like how the way that we use these has changed. We noted how we have these graphite page numbers that someone wrote in later, because to us, oh my gosh, of course you gotta have page numbers. How are you gonna use a book without page numbers? But totally different convention back then, and even now I think the way we do interact with digital books is different fundamentally than how we use printed books or manuscripts too, for that matter, whenever we do run into them.
Well, I mean, I have an Apple Pencil, so.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, so you get it. And but that's interesting is that's gonna come up in the design of how they do digital books in the future. Is how we take notes on it now. Like, where's the marginalia? It's all digital on a copy. Like, that's so interesting to me that's coming from printed books the same way that this manuscript inspired printed books.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, every single thing that we do is impacted by stuff like this that is really old. This is 1500, right? So 500-year-old book.
Yeah.
And it's still informing so much of the way we go through life now. Even if it's not this book, but the things it represents, the things that it is in Congress with, or was.
Exactly. That sort of diversity. That's the other big thing I think about a lot with him, is that we preserve these things because together all of these objects can create a larger sort of quilt for how we view history, and it just broadens things in a way that's so fascinating, because we all have our own individual biases, our own individual stories that we tell. Certainly this book has those as well. You can physically tell by just looking at that this has had a storied past that we can see in a way that you don't with the printed book.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's amazing to think of like that I'm having a dialogue like I'm having with you right now with some dead guy.
Yeah.
Or maybe with Juvenal, for example, or with someone who I don't know who went and repaired this book, or all of the books I've ever written. It's amazing thinking of it as sort of a conversation, and it really is, because it does go both ways. We're both taking from each other and giving something back to each other. It is a conversation, it's a dialogue in that way, even if they're not there, even if they've been in the ground for the past 500 or so years.
And I think the other layer to that is that it's not just a dialogue with these texts and sort of that scholarship in that way, but it's also a dialogue that can only happen because of the intensely personal work that has been done, the artistic work that's been done to create this manuscript in front of us. And I think that's sort of what makes manuscript preservation so special in comparison to sort of print books even, is that you get to see that personal connection with the past.
Yeah.
You get to see how people were.
Yeah. And that's, I think, something we don't get out of the books we use today, is we miss a lot of that human connection. But you're right, this does feel human because of the errors in it, because of some of the places it's a little slipshod, because of the repairs, and more than any of that, because of the care. Because you really can feel how much work went into this, and how much it mattered to someone, that even if they didn't know it was going to last this long, that it made it beyond their borders, beyond what their interest was, you know?
Exactly. They were creating it for themselves, but they were also creating it for people beyond themselves.
They chose to start that conversation with us.
Exactly. They chose to start the conversation. So, I mean, we sort of have that onus on us in some ways to continue that chain, which some days it doesn't feel like it's worth it. I'll say that as a classics student. It feels sometimes that there's such an oversaturation of ideas out into the world. But sometimes all it takes is that sort of step back and looking at something like this that was created by a person that we still have 500 years later, which is still almost impossible for me to wrap my head around. And realizing that although in the age of the internet, it seems like sometimes things don't really have a purpose, that at the end of the day, you can create something that matters to you, and maybe that'll matter to someone 500 years from now if you take the time and the care and the energy to craft it well.
Yeah, well said. If you make it so it's something worth preserving, it's going to be preserved.
Yeah.
You know, and someone made sure they found this book and said this is worth preserving, and someone else found it in a very damaged state, not looking as good as it is today, and said the same thing. I think that's the most beautiful thing, is they were able to find that in a book that was much worse off than the version we have here.
And what does that say about the human condition too? Wow.
Right? Yeah. Oh, there's something good there. There really is. But I think just taking the time to bother learning and wondering about it is kind of all you need. Because this was interesting to me. I picked it up off a shelf for some reasons. I thought it was interesting how there were repairs, and I thought it was a pretty book, if nothing else. But now that I know more about it, I'm even more interested in it sticking around. And I think that just having more of a foothold to wonder on, you know, having something to give more thought to, just makes me care about it more. It goes to show how just learning about anything gives it meaning, you know?
It's all very Benedictine at the end of the day, isn't it?
There is something Benedict about